Welcome, and thanks so much for coming. It's really nice to be here in Tonko Bakery. It's such a perfect environment, and so thanks so much to Flo and Joe and all the team. It's really, really so great of you having us all, and all the refreshments and everything. So delicious. Just a quick note to say that all these talks and everything that we're doing, they wouldn't be possible without the National Heritage Fund that we've been funded by. So for anyone that's new to the project here, we are the Sheffield Wheat Experiment, and so we're creating spaces for conversation and exploration into wheat, but particularly non-commodity and population grains, which you're going to hear more about in this talk, so we won't tell you about it now. So we're in our third year of distributing seed packs across the city for people to become micro growers of a distributed field of wheat. And this growing year, which began in October 2022, we had 245 micro farms pop up across the city, and that's in people's gardens, allotments, in pots, and also different groups like schools. We've got one of the school teachers here, and community groups as well, a few of you here, and lots of you growers are here as well. We're, as well as the micro growing, we're developing a series of engagement, and this program of talks is what we're doing now. And this is the first talk of a whole series, and we're going to hear from bakers and historians, musicians, academics, growers, and there'll be others as well, because it seems to keep developing as we as we go on. Together we want to widen the conversations around grains in the context of food diversity, culture, and climate change. So I'm very happy to introduce our speakers for today. And so we've got Ruth Levine, who is the artist behind the Sheffield Wheat Experiment here, going to be in conversation with Kimberly Bell, who's come up from Nottingham and Small Food Bakery. And just a little intro. So Kim founded the bakery in 2014 with the objective to demonstrate small-scale food manufacturing businesses have a crucial role to play in enabling transition to a more resilient, nourishing and equitable model of agriculture. And also, I just see all the pictures of everything that is coming out of your bakery, and it looks so great, so I definitely want to make it down there soon to try some. So I think so toilets are there, and there's a few refreshments and pastries and things left, but if we wait until the talk will be potentially up to an hour, maybe less, and then we'll have a Q&A after. So if we wait till after the talk, and then if anyone wants more food, we can eat the rest of it up. And I think that's everything. Yeah. So I'll pass you over. Ooh.
Okay.
Stand. Yeah. We're going to stand up.
We're going to stand up because I feel very disconnected when you watch that.
So it might feel a bit weird because we're just going to have a conversation in front of you all standing up.
After about 5 minutes, it'll be like this, and we'll start sinking down. Can you hear us okay? Yeah. Okay. Massive thanks, Kim, for coming.
Pleasure.
I first came across Kim and the Small Food Bakery in the early days of the Wheat Experiment, and then we basically went on a fast-track learning curve through a lot of Kim's work. and have been continue to be inspired by Kim's thinking and what she's doing ever since. But I wanted to start the talk by asking you a question that is nothing to do with bread or baking. So for those who've really come to hear all of the knowledge about bread, sorry, just wait a bit. Because I wanted to understand what you did before you opened the bakery.
Yes, I'm going to paint a picture that you probably weren't expecting to see. As Ruth said, I started the bakery 9 years ago, but prior to that, and in the part of my life between graduating as an art student and then finding the job that I was ultimately meant to do, I ran a construction company, and this company was a small family, like tight-knit team, family-run business, but we operated in a very corporate world, working for clients that we referred to as blue-chip clients. They included BP Oil, the petrol retailer, Starbucks, McDonald's, and some of the big supermarket chains. And it was a time in the sort of late 90s, sort of 2000s, when our nation seemed to be turning into this new sort of retail model where everyone had to have a mini supermarket on the corner, and Starbucks was kind of, on this huge expansion. And people were buying a lot of food from petrol stations because a lot of people were travelling for work and things like that. So our company specialised in building those shops that were like under a certain size, and we could build them in like a week. We were like super fast sort of SWAT team of builders that would come in and convert a shed into a fully functioning crisp and pie shop in record time. And it was an interesting life, quite a depressing one. I spent most of my time on the road, managing teams of people who lived life on the road out of hotels and eating from the shops that we were actually building. And I kind of experienced this sort of evolution of the team and what that was like for life. And also spent time in corporate boardrooms in design meetings with people who represented these blue chip clients and learned a lot about what their priorities were. And I think what Ruth's trying to get me to say is that it taught me everything I needed to know about what a food system absolutely shouldn't be. And I had a kind of horrendous but privileged insight into how these companies made decisions that were entirely financially driven about the sort of life that we all experienced at sort of street level and the way that we maybe interacted with our food through retail models. So when I started the bakery, I was very clear that I wanted to personally, I wanted to come back to a more tangible existence where I wasn't on the road eating McDonald's, doing work on the internet and on a mobile phone. I wanted to do something with my hands. I wanted to make something. I wanted to reconnect with the community where I live and just sort of have a much more like physical life, if that makes some kind of sense. But then also had this kind of intellectual backdrop of everything I've been working on for like 15-year career building these shops was just horrendous. Like literally at every level, there was nothing good about it, from the depression and the kind of stress that people were experiencing working in my line of work, through to the kind of customer experience. Like, I'm going to tell the poo story. So I'm going to give you. I'm going to.
It's not the best way to start a talk on bakeries, but
yeah, I'll give you a couple
it's
of.
where it ends up, so let's just do it.
It's true. I'll give you a couple of little anecdotes just to illustrate for you like the sorts of things I was taking in and thinking this isn't right. And one of the most ridiculous ones was where myself and the team suddenly found ourselves working on a toilet project for BP Oil. We'd been tasked with changing the toilet configuration at all of their service stations up and down the country. It was a great contract. It was going to keep some of our teams in work for a couple of years. And the problem was that the toilets were continuously getting blocked, and they had maintenance crews going out every day to unblock toilets that were basically overflowing. And so our teams were tasked with redesigning the toilets so that they got less blocked and we would rebuild them. And we found ourselves working with Twyfords, who are the manufacturers of the porcelain toilet bowls, to try to redesign a more appropriate toilet for these service stations. And essentially you can imagine what was happening, but basically we needed to make everything flow a lot better, and everything had to be made bigger and wider and designed to make sure it functioned better. And at some point I was just like, what are we doing? This is insane. Like, we're having all these meetings in our office about, and we had things on, like the project manager who was doing it had a pile of these like little white kind of sacks. They look like mini bean bags on his desk one day, and I came in and I was like, what are those? He said, oh, these are Euro turds. And I was like, what's a Euro turd? He said, it's the standard, like, universal measure for what a poo should look like, or like size like. And this is what Twyfords use to test their toilet systems to make sure that they flush. And he'd got 2 on his desk, which were strapped together with gaffer tape too. And that was what we were working to as a design brief. So we had to make our toilets work with 2 Euro turds strapped together. So me as having an overview of what was going on in the company, that was one project. And the other thing we were managing was like really fast turnaround fit outs. So we'd go to a shop and we'd be like, right, we're going to have to close this section to do this bit of the building work, and then for a couple of hours we're going to close this. And all of the store managers were saying to us, you can close anything you like, you shut the petrol down. You cannot stop us selling crisps and pies. That's how we make our money. And if you stop us selling that, like, we're stuffed, basically. So we've got these like 2 dialogues going on at the same time. And obviously, I then started reading more widely about my interest in like food, and particularly with what was happening in America. There was this sort of what they were calling this like food revolution, where people were really starting to look at the connection between different agricultural systems and the way that cities were being developed, and different models of creating like community bakeries and different, and that led me to read about Dan Barber's work and read The Third Plate. Some of you might have come across that book, which led me back to a plant breeder in the Northwest Pacific USA called Stephen Jones, who was running a research outpost there, and he and his researchers were breeding wheats and other cereals for what I came to understand a non-commodity market, and that was somehow feeding into this revolution of like new farmers markets and food kind of activity. I was just totally gripped by this, and then my day-to-day life was, dealing with Euro turds and crisp sales and stuff like that. So that is basically what brought me to small food, and I named the bakery Small Food as a direct reaction to this big food system that I was very against, and I had no idea what I was doing. I have worked as a chef before, and I'm a very passionate cook, always have been. So I had some experience working in kitchens, but I'd never worked in a bakery before. And I thought, this bakery is just going to be about me exploring what the opposite of big food is, hence the name. And I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where that's going to lead me. But if I just set myself this I've got no knowledge at this point, but I thought if I just have the filter of, in terms of my decision making and my design of this business, the filter was literally, what would the big food system do? I'll just do the opposite. And that's how small food has kind of evolved into what it is today, and we've been on like many meandering adventures.
To me it sounds a lot when you talk about small food that from an artist it feels like a project, an experiment in itself, as opposed to I want to set up a business. It's a tool for an exploration into kind of understanding things, meeting people, bringing people together, learning and figuring out another way. So which is a very different mindset, isn't it, from starting up a business? Because I guess from a business perspective, the one thing you don't want to do is fail. If you set out on an experimentation and a learning journey, it's inherent in it that you need to be able to fail to learn anything.
I guess that's why the construction background was important, because I'd already run one of the most difficult and volatile businesses that anyone could ever possibly set out to try to manage. So I was really confident on the business side, and that was such a privileged base to be starting from. And so for me it was very much about the practice and the learning, and it was an experiment. And I did start the bakery in an art centre as well, so that helped, because I had this sort of interested community around me who weren't really expecting me to be too business-like, and that took the pressure off a little bit. It's the bakery is in an old Victorian primary school that was taken over by a collective of artists about sort of 12 years ago now, and the space was allocated and designated for the practice of contemporary art, but there just happened to be the old school kitchen there. And I applied to take it on and luckily got it, and then set up the bakery from there. So there was this really alternative kind of starting point, but I do recognise that I was so confident with the sort of financials and the kind of management of the business, having done this crazy other thing before that I almost didn't think about that very much. That seemed like the easy.
It's a given. Yeah. I think there was something. I mean, I know you set a challenge at the beginning of this bakery journey, but before we come on to that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that insight through the infrastructure, because I found that always really interesting. I've worked with water engineers, I've worked with engineers a lot who are often can be very, very focused on a problem that they have to solve, and there's a kind of rationale and logic to a lot of these problems, but if you stand out and start to see the bigger picture, then you start to see a situation that we're changing our toilet infrastructure because we're eating such bad food that we can't even shit in our own toilets, and then you're suddenly like, where's this coming from? Yeah. But I think there's something around infrastructure and that functionality that is around kind of revealing the systems, making visible these systems that are shaping our everyday lives, but actually we're not kind of viewing them with a lens of, why are we doing this? Where is this going? Is this sustainable for the future? Where has this come from? Who are making these decisions? And who's profiting? And why are these decisions being made? And I think there's a kind of split, isn't there, between people kind of thinking about the whole picture and then people actually having to kind of make that system work.
Yeah, and that's why we need artists, right, to come in and just like poke and question and be like, what the hell is actually happening here? But one of my focuses when beginning this journey was to really look at the supermarket system, and having worked in the design offices of some of these supermarkets, I was quite clear that what they were doing was really wrong, but I didn't really have like the knowledge or, you know, the kind of ability to investigate that. Another sort of anecdote was I was in a design meeting with the Morrisons team, and they were building a new flagship supermarket. We were building the petrol station part. And they were having this whole conversation about this new retina scanner system that they were going to fit in all the shelving. So where the little price barcode things are, they were putting scanners in every single shelf, so that you as a customer were being completely tracked. Your pupils were being tracked as to how they moved across the shelves. And then they've got this amazing like AI data system where your retina movements were being data analysed overnight. And then the store would be re-merchandised overnight, because there's loads of people that go in and move everything around at night, to maximise the sales of the products that they needed to shift. So they would have overstocks of some things, or they'd have things with shorter dates that needed to be moved. And they were so excited that this was going to solve this kind of stock problem for them. And I kind of like started to speak out a bit about how I felt about supermarkets and this kind of food system that they were creating. And it's a really interesting and a big conversation about infrastructure and how it gets designed, because I don't think it has been designed. I think it's sort of happened accidentally. But the interests at play have meant, I'm going to use the word conspiracy, it's sort of an accidental conspiracy that we've done a terrible job at designing our food system. And supermarkets are a fantastic thing to study, I think, in terms of looking at what's gone wrong. But it was quite a hard conversation to have with people, because people do love their food shopping. It's quite, it's a really sacred part of our lives to go into a shop and to choose for ourselves what we want to eat. And actually a lot of people told me they really enjoy going to the supermarket. And one of the commonly held beliefs was that the supermarkets offered them a lot of choice. And so I thought I'd dive into that a little bit, because I was thinking about this retina scanner thing, and I was like, those two things don't really sit sort of side by side. I feel like we're being really manipulated. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of free choice kind of going on. And I'm coming from like a kind of really interested in food, chef background. And one of the simple motivations for starting the bakery was just that I couldn't find anything to eat anymore, and like nothing was delicious. Like I wanted to eat more fresh fruit and vegetables and things and enjoy that. But I found like, without applying all the chef tricks in the book and adding loads of salt and fat and sugar, I couldn't get it to taste nice. And I thought, this is not... I've got memories of being a kid and going camping in France and like having a tomato when it's in season and it being really yummy, and my granddad growing courgettes in his garden and them being really yummy, and I'm not seeing that anymore. And I felt like the quality of everything was just going down and down. But so anyway, I wanted to sort of, that was just like, my own appetite was motivating this inquiry. But I thought, let's look at some statistics about supermarkets and whether they in fact offer us choice. And I came across an amazing article published in The Grocer, which is an industry mag for big retailers. which interestingly is not available publicly anymore, but it was a fascinating set of data, and it was just a chart from 2014, the year I started Small Food, and it listed all of the top 10 highest grossing products that were sold in the UK through the supermarket system. And just to give you an idea of how powerful the supermarket system is, at that time, 97% of all of our food grocery was sold through supermarkets. And 70% of that was sold by 4 brands. So we were talking about like Asda, Sainsbury's, Safeway, or, I can't remember what they were at the time. So there's already this kind of oligopoly going on of like these, and they were all selling the same products and they were all tracking your retinas. So I was like, what do they actually sell us if people have this belief that they're still free-spirited when they walk in the door and that they're going to buy what's good for them and what will nourish them in their lives? It's really interesting to look at this top 10 grossing products. So the top one was vodka, and then it was crisps, vodka. Then it was Hovis 800-gram white slice. Then it was Warburton's 800 grams white slice. Then it was crisps again. Then it was Kingsmill 800 grams white slice. Then it was whiskey. And the money involved in these product lines was astonishing. So I'm kind of thinking, I was experiencing that maybe my food culture's dumbed down a bit and I'm not really finding anything delicious to eat anymore. And I haven't really got any local shops anymore. I can only go to these mini supermarkets on the street corner that have got even less choice than the big ones. And then at the same time, I'm like, what does that mean for our nation? What does that mean for us? What is our food culture? And food culture for me is like culture. That's like who we are as a people, and it's how we build our society, is around the growing and the exchange and the production of food. So what does this list say about England? And it was quite shocking. And I think when you present that kind of data to people, they're like, oh yeah, okay, maybe we do have a bit of a problem. And maybe we should do something about it.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring you on. You started this bakery, or this journey, and pretty early on you get challenged to make a sustainable loaf. And that takes you all sorts of places, but one of the places it takes you to is a farm called Wakelands, that's farmed by Martin Wolf, and that kind of opens up a whole door to the grain and the wheat behind the flour. And there was something interesting that you mentioned about, who owns what and how many companies, and once you start investigating all of this is mimicked across the board. This is the same for seeds behind the wheat, behind the flour, and this is the same all over, isn't it? It's the kind of pyramid of ownership and what that really means. So, but this is a kind of opposite story. So you come across Martin's population, and which you can just explain to people. And we have, I don't know, a lot of growers here who might have heard this story before. If you're growing with us, for those who aren't, if you could get a bit of an idea.
Yeah, so as I said, I didn't really know what I was doing when I started this bakery. I thought sourdough was really cool. So if I just learn how to make bread with this, symbiosis of amazing microbes, then sure, I don't know, I just thought surely that's a good place to start. So I started by making sourdough. And having a chef background, I kind of knew a little bit about how to deal with provenance of other ingredients. I knew where I wanted to buy meat from if I needed it, for example, and chocolate and coffee and things like that. Seemed like there was a lot of conversation about sourcing. But I decided to try to open up my community around the things I was interested in the bakery. I would host a banquet and screen a film by Joel Salatin, who was one of the people I was reading about in the States and kind of observing what was happening over there, talking about mob grazing. And it was this very early days conversation about soil health and how that might actually be relevant to us or important to our food. And I thought people need to start thinking about this. This is kind of a cool film, let's show it. And I asked a friend of mine who was an environmentalist and also local small-scale farmer, and he was growing salad for me at the bakery, to come and help me curate a banquet And I knew he would challenge me. He was a real arse, but in a great way. And so he sort of came in. We were like co-designed the menu. He was also a really good forager, and it was February in Nottingham. And I was like, every ingredient at this banquet has to have been, obtained locally, and it has to be seasonal, and there needs to have been no external horrific implications of us selecting it, basically. But then I was like, in my mind, I was just merrily making sourdough to go along the banquet table because it was a bakery and I wanted to advertise that. So John was like, Kim, you can't put bread on the table. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, wheat is a monoculture. And it's horrendous. The whole kind of farming of it is horrendous. And where do the seeds come from? And he's like, you just can't put, he's like, can't you make some bread with nuts or something? And I was like, no. So then I was like, oh shit, I'm going to have to work a bit harder than I thought. And he said, go to Wakeland's agroforestry. They at least grow wheat in lines of trees. So it's a bit more diverse, a bit more of a polyculture. He would accept that going on the table if I could use the wheat that was grown at Wakeland's. And I'd heard of Wakeland's, but I'd never really thought about it in terms of my work or the relevance of visiting there. But because John had challenged me, I had to go. So I went to visit Martin Wolf, who was he was 78 the day that I met him, and he had spent his whole life working in plant breeding, beginning with a career at the British Plant Breeding Institute, and then moving through various institutions in Europe. And his motivation or interest was to breed cereal crops, mostly barley actually, for organic farming systems, and to try to come up with ways of creating seed that worked in, let's say, the alternative systems without all the chemicals. I was going to nip back to what you said about the kind of seed, the seed oligopoly, if you like, around the world is really fascinating. And if anyone's interested in these issues around power and control in our food system, Google a guy called Phil Howard, who is a professor at Michigan State University, and he does all these amazing infographics about who holds all the power in different parts of the food system. So he's done beer. Do you know that 4 companies brew something like 90% of the world's beer? 4 companies.
You did that horrendous talk at Grainlab as well, which kind of also talked about how those companies have craft beer subsidiaries that are pseudo-craft.
So you don't know.
So you won't know.
At the moment he's investigating this kind of alternative protein thing that's emerging and who has all the power and control in that. But previously he's looked at seed, and he's got some amazing statistics, which I'm just going to make up, but they're roughly in the right ballpark.
I think actually if you're a grower, you would have got this poster
from him, yeah. So it's something like, 4 companies own about 80% of the world's seed for agriculture. Own it, yeah. So that's really significant in terms of me rocking up at Martin's agroforestry farm. So I was at the point in my journey where I was like, I'm really interested in farming systems, and I want to know if I'm going to buy ingredients, what sort of farming system do I want to support? And I put that in inverted commas because I hate that language, but that's how I felt at the time. Really, I've since learned that that's very much supporting us. But what I didn't expect was that Martin would even really be bothered about spending time with us. And me and my baker colleague Laura really naively turned up at his door, a bit kind of oh my god, this guy's kind of a bit famous in the academic world, why does he want to spend any time with him? He just opened his door and really enigmatically said, I've been waiting for someone like you to come. Come in. And then he made us a coffee and we sat around the table and he explained agroforestry to us, and we walked the agroforestry in February, and it was a landscape that I'd never seen before. Just 12-metre strips of trees. There were coppicing trees for energy production. There were fruit trees for food, and nut trees. And then there was a whole section of hardwoods that were enormous and eventually would be cut down for timber for construction and things. And all in 12-metre alleys with crops growing in between, or kind of rest lays, just rest periods to allow the ground to recover. And there was this whole kind of complex rotation going on. And the thing I hadn't expected, I knew there was wheat in this rotation, but the thing I hadn't expected was Martin sat down and gave us an education about the way that wheat behaves. And he told me to develop this whole new this wheat it was called at the time the ORC Wakeland's population. Yeah, I hadn't really expected this education about seed, and he explained about the kind of oligopoly of ownership around seed, the idea that seeds could be patented and that the genetics were owned. extrapolate that to loads of other areas of life, and you really start to question that as a value system. And then he explained to me that in the UK we still have a really archaic seed system. We have a system whereby farmers can only trade seeds which are on something called the National Recommended List. So if you look at the National Recommended List, which incidentally is written and completely controlled by the top few biggest millers in the country. It's not even controlled by a government department. It's like milling industry business that select these seeds. And they control all the data and they publish all the data each year. And if you're an organic farmer, you're really limited as to what seeds you can actually buy and grow. And they all come from this very, very narrow list. So again, there's just this narrowing of diversity and this like narrowing of choice. All the time we're losing agency in our food system. So Martin explained to me that he'd been working with organic farmers to try and find wheat seeds that were successful without needing the use of all these kind of chemicals. And he just wanted to achieve something that was going to be consistently yielding. So we're not going for massive yields, we're just going for something that's reliable so that we actually have food security. And he'd started off his career looking at his adventures into this chapter of his career, looking at mixing different varieties. So they could be like 4 varieties from the national list and just mix them together in a field. And he found, interestingly, that organic farmers would gain a higher yield if they mixed 4 varieties of seeds together. And the simple logic was they all have different genetics. They're all going to respond differently in any given year to climate, pest kind of conditions. And it's the idiom of like hedging your bets, isn't it? So something's going to work, you're going to get a yield. But then in his retirement, he started this project creating what he called a cross-composite population, where he took 20 wheat seeds that were all standard modern varieties. This is not a heritage wheat project. It's literally like it was all modern kind of varieties. And he selected 10 for yield and 10 for quality off these lists. And he crossbred them every which way with the help of the John Innes Centre. Created 200 new parent plants and then drilled them into the alleys at Wakelands. And then made no further selection. So every year the seed was grown, and then it was replanted and grown again. And that's really significant because what he was interested in was getting the agroforestry system to choose the seeds that were going to be successful and not overlaying any kind of like human assumption about what quality was or what things should be like. And when we got there, he was in field trial year 17 of doing this. So this seed had kind of coexisted with the agroforestry. Anyway, I was like, great. That's perfect. John will let me use that. It's such a good story. It's like, you know, it attacks the power system. It's like, you know, perfect, beautiful landscape, and it's just everything's great here and peaceful. And you walk into a place like Wakelands, and your appetite tells you that you want to eat the food that's grown there. You don't need to know anything about the science or what's happening. You just hear the birds and the trees, and you feel safe, and it's beautiful, and that you know you want to eat that stuff. But anyway, I'm going a little bit off track.
No, that's okay. But I think this is. Let's get into the baking.
Okay.
What is it like to bake with these grains, and fundamentally, what is it about these grains that different to what you would get from your commercial, chemically linked baking grains? Because there's a lot of the grain that's grown, certainly in this country, but most of it goes for feed to animals, not to go to bread. So there's kind of there's within this national recommended list, which I think, did you mention distinct, uniform and stable?
Oh yeah.
So it has to kind of essentially, to be on this list, your seed has to be seen as distinct, uniform and stable, which means you need to be able to evidence that it's consistent. Essentially, it's a monoculture. That's what it
every plant is genetically identical,
which is kind of everything that you don't want, and you have from a heterogeneous population, which we'll talk about in a minute. But from a baker's perspective, if you get a bag of flour that, you know, from a distinct, uniform and stable kind of recommended list, what's the difference?
Yeah, I guess it's like distinct, uniform and stable. It's like a value system that has somehow gone from the seed right through to the bakeries. And it's so, if you imagine that the millers are selecting the seed, the plant breeders are breeding to try to get on that list. So we've got this, again, this invisible infrastructure that's being somehow designed, but is anyone actually designing it? It's kind of like weird collaboration. So the industry is telling the plant breeders what they need, the milling industry, that is, not even the baking industry necessarily. And then we're kind of, again, creating this sort of narrowing. So Martin was trying to create this crop that wasn't distinct, uniform or stable, because he believed that our agriculture or nature didn't want distinct, uniform and stable, and that wasn't particularly successful. So he was offering a wheat that was so far away from the standard industry focus or metrics, and all of these other seeds that had gone through all these breeding bottlenecks to create things like high protein, which bakers seem to think they value for creating strong doughs. There were certain like starch levels that were trying to be achieved, and then there's something called there's like kind of enzymic reaction rates and things like that, so that the way that the grain ferments is really important. And these things only need to be controlled and narrowed if you have really rigid manufacturing systems. So Martin said to me, no, I've been trying for about 10 years to get a baker to work with this grain because I want to be able to sort of demonstrate it more widely as a useful thing to then encourage farmers to grow it. And he said, I can't, so I had to sort of explain to him about Instagram and crumb shots, which for any of you who don't know what that is basically like a cross-section of a bread that shows how great you are as a baker. And there's this like international standard, like visual standard of what a loaf of bread should look like, and it comes largely from San Francisco and the kind of strong baking culture that has been born there with the likes of Tartine Bakery. And many bakers all over the world try to copy that style of baking. And I was like, Martin, your wheat is not going to make this bread. And that's why they're not interested. So it opened up this whole kind of conversation about, like, we're building this artisan bakery industry in the UK. It was quite young at the time. There was like E5 Bakehouse in London. There was a few other sourdough bakeries popping up around the country. There was no bakeries in Nottingham at all. I was the first to restart that kind of culture. And I was like, so why are we copying this idea, this value system of really narrow ideals, which seem to have been sort of accidentally, happened upon in industry, because they've been trying to make everything super efficient for so long and make everything work with machines. But we've come along with these values of wanting to reconnect with our communities and do things by hand and try to be more thoughtful in our approach, yet somehow there's still this artisan baking culture that isn't doing any of those things, and we're still trying to conform to global standards of quality. Anyway, I said to Martin, I'd love to bake with your wheat, partly because I had John in my ear, like with this pressure for this banquet, and I had to do it. I said, I'm not a very good baker, I'm not that experienced, but if you'll permit me, I'd like to take some of the crop and we'll get it milled and we'll make it work. And I then began a baking practice of working with what we nicknamed the YQ population, the flour, and learning to be in conversation with it and in a relationship with it in a way that was such a privilege. And over the last few years, I feel like through trying to block out all of the noise about how you should bake and all the techniques you should use and all the rules and the dogmas around it, I've been trying to just be in conversation with this wheat and it just be me and it. And then through doing that and through just really exploring all of the variables that I could think of, and being totally prepared to fail, which I did like massively for ages, developed a bread making practice with Martin's wheat. He was delighted. The first loaf, apparently, I posted it to him, and a friend was there when he received it. Apparently, he danced around his kitchen with the loaf in the air like this, and he was very supportive of our endeavours.
I just wanted to bring you right forward to a visit that happened recently, slightly linked to a project that we're doing, which really is exploring this kind of industry mindset within an artisan sort of craft setting. And it was the visit to Shipton Mill. Could you just tell that story? Because I think this, like, for me, that story really kind of reveals how somehow, a culture you don't recognise. It's so embedded. It's kind of there. It exists. You don't even question it. But this culture that's kind of grown up around us with this kind of industry and commercialisation, capitalism, however you want to see it, is still really embedded and still really invisible. But there's little moments of punctuation and idiosyncrasy and oddities that kind of pop out and that reveal these sort of absurdities, don't they? And I think the Shipton Mill visit was a really interesting one.
That's where I started baking with Shipton. Any bakers in the room probably know Shipton Mill, and a lot of artisan bakeries use Shipton No. 4, which is a really great quality flour, and that's how I started my sourdough practice. And Shipton Mill is a really great business. It's run by a guy who's quite like eyes wide open about all the ethical issues, and they try really hard to buy, you know, UK grown grain, and they do a lot of organic and stuff. And yeah, there's a lot of really good things about this mill, but it's a roller mill, small by roller mill standards, but it's a very industrial mill. And lorries go in and they tip grain into a hole in the ground, and then it goes through the system of like you know, augers and moves around, and people don't really touch it, and it goes through these really noisy machines and then like big sieves and things. Anyway, they were so kind to allow me and a group of other folks from the UK Grain Lab community to come and learn about their processes. And in particular, we were interested in these industry metrics that decide whether or not a wheat is quality enough to go into the baking system. As Ruth said earlier, a lot of wheat that gets grown in organic systems gets dumped into animal feed markets for a very low price. Which, the more you think about that, that's really problematic, because essentially we're trying really hard to like grow organic cereals, and organic farming is all about like community and trying to get food, healthy food into local community. And the way they treat their animals is usually exemplary. But actually a lot of this, the outputs of their farm are kind of accidentally supporting industrial animal agriculture, which is horrific. And anyway, where was I? I got lost.
The Shipton Mill.
Oh yeah, back to Shipton Mill.
And I'm also aware this is, I've only got through my first page.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Quick, hurry up, Kim.
Okay, so Shipton Mill, they were really kind, and I was really interested in these kind of metrics and like where they come from and why they exist. And so they gave us a day. It was me and a researcher and 3 bakers and a farmer, and we got to learn about all their machines that they test the wheat. So they take a small sample off the lorry, they chuck it in this incredible computer, that analyses it and then gives them all this data. And this computer is calibrated to every one of its type all over the world. So that's how it calibrates its quality mechanism. So I'm like, again, global, like quality, like, you know, ambitions for quality. Like, what is going on here? And they have all these other machines, and they actually have an incredible library of really ancient machines. And we spent all day with the technicians testing 4 wheats that were grown on Fred, the farmer who was with us, farm. And they were all wheats that the bakers had all worked with. So we had direct experience of working with them. We knew their characters and we knew what we could do with them, but we wanted to see what happened when we ran them through these industry tests. And they gave us all this data and all these like graphs and charts and things that were just, and watching the machines was so exciting and compelling. And we were just fascinated. Like, there's a machine called a Chopin alveograph that blows bubbles, and then they measure like the kind of footprint of the bubble, and that's to see how a dough system is both extensible and elastic. So that's
so
like,
beautiful. Isn't it? You
it's incredible.
Video of it. It's just like a sphere. It's like a bubble gum.
Yeah.
Sphere.
But we forgot ourselves basically, and they were like, "Wow, that's so cool!" And then we sat down for lunch with the technicians, and Rosie, one of the bakers, had baked the same wheats up into breads, and we sat and shared lunch and looked at all the data. And the technicians had told us, well, there's 2 wheats on here that absolutely won't make bread. It's just not possible. And then the others are just not very good, but they, you know, you might be able to, we would probably like blend them in with some other stuff to try and make them work. So then we like had this beautiful display of like incredible breads. Rosie's an amazing baker. And we sat down for lunch and we ate them, and we kind of put the labels on, and the technicians were like, what? And they really enjoyed them, and we offered them the bread to take home, and they actually chose the 2 breads that were the ones that were impossible to bake to take home for their families, because they really enjoyed the flavour and the softness and the bite. And it was just an amazing like reminder of how we've detached our appetites from the logic of these huge infrastructures that are designing what happens with our food, and maybe we need to reconnect on a really, really kind of visceral, simple level to make better choices. But even the farmer, he's been working he's got got the biggest living collection of wheat in the UK for sure. He's obsessed with getting interesting stuff from gene banks and growing it up to see whether it's useful.
Went on the website. I have just got to say this.
Oh, yeah.
You get to went on the website and select all
for the American Gene Bank.
The American Gene Bank, and then bought how many?
I think it was 2,000 or 3,000.
2,000 or 3,000 different samples. Got them posted and then planted.
Yeah, he's totally bonkers. So, but he's all in. He's got skin in the game. And even he was like, "But Kim, surely we just have to find that one magic wheat that fits the metrics, and then we can grow that." And these things are like a constant reminder that no, we need to step completely outside of that mindset, that framework, and we need to design our own sense of quality. And that might be different from one community to another community. And that's okay. Why do we need to calibrate with everybody else around the world? We know what's happening in our area. And the more connection we have with growers and with the land, as bakers, the more sensible decisions we can make about our procurement, and we can join in. And I think, that's kind of why, for me, one of the most important things, or what I think one of the most important things that I can do is to recognise my place in agriculture. Because even though I work in an inner city bakery doing semi-industrial food production and actually very rarely go out on farms, I try to go as much as I can, I definitely realise that I am part of the agricultural system, and I make decisions that influence the way that agriculture is designed, and take that very seriously.
I think I just want to also bring that directly. If you haven't already, there's Kim's bought some bread samples with her, so on the way out, taste some. When we first gave our little bags of flour out to the growers that grew the wheat, and we had no idea what we were doing with the baking, and then we got these lovely little pictures of these incredibly dense, short loaves back. But we had this repeated comment from lots of people, and it was all around how tasty it was, and how nutty it was, and how, oh, that's how my grandma used to make. That's the bread my grandma used to make. So there was this kind of couple of decades kind of memory of what bread used to taste like and feel like even. Is there any evidence or much research going into the nutrition as well as the flavour of these grains? There is the whole gluten story, which we don't have time for exactly.
Well,
but, can we touch on something around?
I think the most important thing to realise is, and Stephen Jones at the breeding outpost in Northwest Pacific, USA, who is one of my heroes, told me, he said, "No, I've never been asked to breed for nutrition, and I've never been asked to breed anything for flavour." They do both of those things, but they've never been asked to, and that's the point. And I just think that's probably the most important thing. Yes, there are niche bits of research going on, incredibly interesting research about nutrition, but in the big system, that's not the kind of dialogue. We get these kind of really reductionist, stupid, simplified things like the first the first kind of license to bring genetic modification into wheat seeds in the UK was done under the guise that we need to develop a wheat with more iron in it. Right, so basically the reason that our bread doesn't have iron in it is because we sieve away all of the nutrition in these giant roller mills, and we make white flour, and we give all of the nutritious stuff to animals to eat. And then the sugary part, which is devoid of all micronutrients and fibre, those micronutrients is iron. So the GM project, the one that got the licence at Rothamsted to go first in the UK to break through this blockade we got on GM, which I thought was great, was to put iron in the white part of the flour. And again, we're just going back to the bloody Euroturd analogy of instead of fixing the problem, we're coming up with a kind of sticking plaster solution. So we're prepared to accept the commodity, we're accepting the chemicals, we're accepting the poor milling, the choices at milling that they're not helping our diet. We're accepting the really thoughtless baking culture that we've created, and we're solving the problem by putting the iron in with the sugar and the protein. Yeah.
I really want to pick out the whole meal on that, because and the fibre and that story, because that's So the Sheffield Wheat experiment took 5 bakers, 4 of which were, hello, just waving at you, from Tonko last week to Kim, and we did a kind of workshop on a population tin loaf made from YQ. And every time I see this, it's just so shocking. So we kind of milled the grain, and then you do the sieving, and how much. So Kim kind of has a drawing of a grain, and where all the fibre and all the goodness is, and how that kind of immediately gets sieved out. But proportionately, that's a huge amount of the wheat gone. So if you think about it from a farmer's perspective, he grows a field of wheat, you get, 40% or something like that?
40% might get discarded if you're going for a super, super white flour. I mean, there are grades in between.
But that part of the field's got all of the stuff we need, our bodies need, and we give that to animals to feed and to go into that system, and then we kind of, so it's the waste. But when we did that test, when we have that test kind of, and you sieve it out by hand, and you just see this massive pile of goodness that goes, you kind of, it's another ask about way of thinking.
The way I began to think about it was on farm with Martin, and I was so in love with Wakeland's agroforestry, and he was talking about this thing called like total yield. He had some good terminology that I've forgotten, but like instead of looking at the yield of single crops, he was like trying to promote to people the idea of the yield of the whole farm in calories. So that included the energy from the coppice wood as well as the calories from the wheat and all this kind of stuff. And that isn't even really looking at micronutrients. But I was just, and he proved that this system of agroforestry is by far the most efficient farming system. And that's one of the big dogmas that we really need to try to overcome, is this idea that we do things a certain way because they're efficient. And, you know, it's a bit like you can make up a statistic to back up anything you really want to say. And that's the problem with these efficiency metrics, is actually when you really start to interrogate what that efficiency means, you realise that these big industrial systems are really inefficient. And what Martin had done on this tiny farm was incredible, because he just demonstrated how this very natural and beautiful and, I don't know, just appetite-worthy system of farming that was supporting all kinds of wildlife and like complexity of other benefits was actually way more efficient than a chemical, like broadacre farm. And I think like when I saw that and when I felt that was an incredibly moving thing to realise, and at that point I said, I'm never going to bake with the YQ. Out of respect for what Martin's done, I'm only ever going to bake it wholemeal. Because if he's going to go to that trouble to run something so complex and create something so beautiful for purpose of efficiency, I need to hold that value myself. And so, as you know, with the YQ, I only bake wholemeal bread, and I use it for wholemeal short crust pastry, which we did in the workshop as well. And I use it for sort of sourdough scones that I've been developing. They're wholemeal, and it's been a really interesting filter or like kind of like funnel for me to work within, because it's forced me to really push myself technically, because I really want to demonstrate to people that it's more delicious and that you can still do technically amazing things with it. And that's been one of the challenges I've kind of set myself. And I think we're converting people slowly to the idea that it is more tasty.
It's a couple more questions. I'm aware of time, and I really want to open it up to the audience. There will be time for lots of questions. But
we can go. We started a little bit late.
Did we? Okay. All right. Well, there's still a couple of questions that I want to put. And one of the things in relation to that is back to the hidden and the invisibility. And I really want to talk about cost and value, because one of the things always thrown at independent craft bakers is the price of the loaf. But beyond that, you know, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because it seems to me that, you know, there is the price of the loaf, and then there's the hidden costs of eating that loaf as a society.
Yeah, so I think through my years of practice and thinking about this, I am, with no evidence whatsoever, to give you, and one day I hope to give you that evidence, is I am utterly convinced that my method of bread production is more efficient if you take into account all the things that go before it, the milling, the farming, all of the kind of benefits. And I would really like to work with an economist to prove that. And there have been studies done in other parts of the food system that have demonstrated that logic within small-scale kind of production, like in veg growing and retailing, for example. And I'd love to do it with a loaf of bread, but I just know, and I can't prove it to you, I just know that my bread is cheaper. And so it's a really difficult place we find ourselves, where actually people say, well, we couldn't just have like really expensive bakeries on every street corner, because that would exclude loads of people, and that's quite right. But again, it's this dogma of like efficiency, and what I would say is this is about unpicking what that means, and I think accessibility is probably more the issue rather than price, because we've massively detached cost and value in our food system. So unless we can join those two things back together, I don't think we're getting a fair comparison at all. And so I'd love to see, like, if you add in all the subsidies that the taxpayers pay towards those industrial bread systems, right back to the farming systems, and then sort of like take them off or give them to me to make my loaves, I think we would be cheaper. But we're fighting against a really like orderly, organised, rigid system that we can't take part in any of those benefits. We're just like outliers doing our own thing because we believe in it. And we have to internalise all of the costs of doing that. And we also, take very seriously other kind of responsibilities, like paying people properly and paying farmers properly, which doesn't happen in the bigger industry and things like that. So yeah, it's complicated.
You talk about responsibility also quite beautifully and I'm thinking about maybe it'd be interesting to tell people about your use of sugar in the bakery as well, because you talk about bakers being responsible feeders of society. Like, you have a responsibility as much as a GP would have a responsibility to look after people, the people who are in charge of producing the food that goes into our food systems that people buy is your responsibility as a baker. Can you just like talk about that, but maybe also for the bakers in the room, how, certainly in relation to maybe sugar and wholemeal, how do your customers take this, because I guess you've kind of created customers along the journey of your exploration who are slightly buying into your journey. But for an established bakery who's wanting to bring in more population grains and more wholemeal, how do they even go about that in relation to their customers?
Well, we've taken the customers on a journey with us, and I think my appetite has changed, or my palate has changed a lot through changing the way, changing the food that I produce in the bakery, changed the way I eat. So I've developed a palate for less sweet and more wholemeal stuff, and I think a lot of the customers have come along from that ride. But how do you get buy-in from them in the first place? It's like sort of slowly and kindly is the approach, and I think a lot of them really appreciate the storytelling, and also we have extended many an invitation for our customers to join us in some of our learning experiences. We've been working with Nottingham University to do sensory evaluations on our breads and crops, and we invite customers and sort of like prominent people in our community to come in and take part in that, and that can be big light bulb moments for people, just like relating what's happening in the bakery to what they're eating and what they're experiencing without those kind of overlaid preconceptions about what they think about wholemeal. And it's really big. It's like very cultural to take people on that journey. But there's also this thing, like for me as a baker, this was really important, this realization that I can have two hats on, because I put my hat on as a feeder and I take that responsibility really seriously. And in 8 years, we've weaned a lot of babies at Small Food. I've seen pregnant women come in the bakery. They often come, that's a huge, like a hugely important time for women when they get pregnant. They often then reassess their food choices and they start to search out things they can enjoy, like bakeries and things. So we get a lot of pregnant people coming in for the first time, and then we watch the babies be born and then eventually weaned on our bread, and it's very real, that responsibility. So and it's great because kids have amazing taste. They just love it straight away. But I also really like making confectionery and stuff that's not very healthy. So like like lots of conversations with myself about whether a croissant is a necessary part of our food system. And that's a whole other talk. But I think okay for an artisan to accept that they hold these two roles and they can sit side by side responsibly. And I can make both a croissant and also a loaf of bread, and I can do both of them in the right way and accept that they have different purposes in our food system, and that something's a treat and it's a confectionery and something else is just basic staple food. And I think, you know, the way that we present that in bakery is potentially not something that's been looked at in the artisan bakery movement. I'm now looking at the bakery and the bakers over there, but like maybe there's some work we can do there with the customers to get them to understand that distinction, because I want to keep making those really fun things for people and brightening up their weekends. And I will do it as best I can, but that's going to involve white flour, and they are sugary. But, you know, in terms of the sugar issue, it's bakeries' inputs are sort of flour, fat and sugar. And we really have to look at the fat and sugar as well as a bakery community, and that's not what we're here to talk about today. But the same issues exist in these food groups, and like so we've been trying to train people into more complex sugars. We use a lot of honey, we use apple molasses, we use raw cane panela that's brought over by sail cargo, and just really just trying out to see how we feel about all of these different products and whether people respond to them. Because at some point we're going to have to deal with the issue, and British Sugar is another monopoly. They're powerful government lobbyists. They have too much power in this country, eroding our democracy, in my opinion. That lobby group is completely responsible for the U-turn on the use of neonicotinoids on crops which are killing bee colonies. They're so powerful. You know, it's just insane, and we've got to like erode that power and come up with our own sort of solutions if we're going to stop feeling depressed about these bigger problems.
I just want to finish and open up to questions, but I want to finish on one thing that sprung to mind when you were talking about kind of, you know, bakeries kind of joining this movement essentially. And one of the things that we think about quite a lot, the wheat experiment, is how diversity is resilience. And for us that comes down to the core of the seed. A population of wheat has many varieties, and we know that on the farm with climate change weathers are going to get more disruptive, they're going to get more rains, hotter, and these grains will be able to respond much more to those varying climates. But it strikes me when you talk that this is the same for the bakeries, you know, so the very fact that if we could get lots and lots of bakeries finding their own voices, their own ways, their own routes, their own baking styles, that actually that resilience is just as important in a kind of makeup of food suppliers and producers as it is
it's
in
true.
the farm.
I always say, like, I love YQ, Wakeham's population. I love I'm so privileged to have this relationship to it. And the relationship continues, because actually we haven't talked about this at all, but we're lobbying the government for changes in the seed laws based around what's happening in the UK Grain Lab movement as an evidence base to say we need to change it, because we can't keep going with this distinct, uniform and stable filter if we're going to improve farming. But the danger is that because of the culture we live in, this kind of Instagram sort of fashion-led thing, is that I don't want everyone to copy what I'm doing. That's not the point. Like, I want everyone to have their own population of wheat and to have a relationship to it, not to be like, we use this population that Kim said we should use, because that's just putting the power with me, and that's wrong, because I'm limited in what I can offer. But together, if everyone puts their brains to it and everyone connects on some level to agriculture, and kind of, we can like collectively come up with a whole diversity of ideas. And I think it's that diversity of ideas that we're going to need to get through the next few years. And I've already seen the climate shifting and the problems with some of the farmers that we've been working with. And when you, as a baker, are working with a farmer and you know them and you know their family, and they come for dinner and you go there for lunch, and when their crop fails, it's really big, and you really feel it, and you really feel your sense of responsibility in that. And when you set yourself this like tight boundary of using local crops, when your local crop fails, you're like, shit, that's, I'm not allowed to go, John won't let me go back and buy the Shipton number 4. So, that's very real to me now. And I think, I totally agree. Like, I kind of started bringing together a gathering called UK Grain Lab because I realised we needed many minds on the problem, and we need many solutions, and also everyone needs to feel agency and empowerment over their own food system, and it's not for any one of us to sort of dictate to other people how they manage their own food. We just need to uplift and empower and kind of give people more confidence to get involved. I think it's kind of the main thing.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Yeah.
I'm fully aware there's lovely tasting cakes and tea and breads at the back, but don't move, please, because once you're up, then it's kind of like I'm never going to get you back down again.
Unless you leave the toilet, you can go to the toilet.
Yes, you're allowed to go to the toilet. But I would really like you to dig deep and use this bit of time to fire any questions that you have, however broad or practical, conceptual or.
But before
sorry, I wasn't accusing you of doing one or the other.
Before anyone asks a question, can I just ask a question? I wonder if everyone could put their hand up if they relate, like, to what they relate to in terms of where they fit in the wheat system or the cereal system. Could everyone put their hands up if they are a grower? And then everyone put their hands up if they are a baker or some kind of food producer. And then anyone put their hands up if they are an artist, activist, somebody who's kind of interested in systems. And yeah, thanks. It was really nice for me to just see a little bit about who.
Anyone eat bread?
Thank you.
Tracy, anyone doesn't?
Oh yeah, I should have asked that question.
The finance administrator behind the Sheffield Wheat experiment is Sina. That's commitment.
Yeah.
Sorry, Laura, you had a question.
How do you propose that we bring together the bakers as like a network to support this transition?
Can I just check if everyone heard that?
I'll relay the question. So the question was, how do I propose that we support bakers in coming together to sort of network and create a transition? Is that right? Thinking about this issue back in 2017, I started bringing together groups of bakers and farmers and researchers under the banner of something called UK Grain Lab, which is like one of those, it doesn't really exist, but everybody's part of it. You know, it's like, and we just have meetings and we come together and learn from each other. And then there was lots of spin-offs from that, where lots of regional groups got established because people realised that they knew someone from down the road, or they met someone from down the road that they didn't know existed, and they were interested in similar things. So there are now regional groups that are very early days, like bubbling up around the UK. So you have a Yorkshire Grain Alliance that's in its very infancy, but has some great folks involved in it so far. So you can connect through that social media with that. It's a good starting point. And then the national gathering is possibly of interest. But one of the things I've been very excited about recently is really like micro-local. So I've been working with a miller who also grew some crops in Nottinghamshire in an agroforestry that's trying to mimic Wakelands, and I'm very excited about this. And we did a really cool thing in the bakery. It was really simple, where we just invited people from every bakery in Nottingham to come and help be a lab. And what we wanted to do was take Emma's crops that she'd grown and the flour that she milled and just spend a day playing. And actually just through conversation, through play, through kind of like realising how important it was to Emma that we found a way to engage with these crops, we all kind of bonded a little bit, and everybody brought completely different things to the table and it was like really good imagination space. And then there was a sort of sense of collaboration across the different businesses as well. And we all made a bit of a commitment to try to use Emma's crop, but little things like that can just be like micro-organised by bakery businesses or by projects like the Sheffield Wheat experiment. And I guess everyone will have a different
It's probably worth saying to bakers that so last week the Wheat experiment brought 5 bakers together to do something like that. Out of that came a conversation that the bakers really need, not a workshop on how to do, but they need a play day, essentially, an experimental day. And then there was much conversation that was, what the fantasy would be, could we find the money to employ someone to be a baker, experimental baker in residence? So one of your bakers' kind of sole job is to explore and experiment with different grains. But I think last week proved to be pretty successful, and if we can
find the money to do that, we'd be happy to bring more Sheffield bakers together to have one of those sessions as a kind of just catalyst.
And bring chefs in as well.
Is that what you were? Laura's on the list.
Yeah. But also bring in, like, think about people who make pasta, who very often work in restaurant kitchens, but you know, there are now like noodle businesses popping up, and people from like completely different cultural backgrounds to maybe what we think of when we come to an artisan bakery like this, who work with flour. Like, we've been working with a guy who makes these Caribbean patties, and it's been really fascinating to talk to him about his motivations and kind of like ideas and techniques that have never featured in my bakery. And the more diversity you bring into the conversation, the more amazing things come out of a day of playing. But we used to do also something at Small Food that came out of the very first Grain Lab. We had a tutor from School of Artisan Food, Wayne Caddy, who came to Grain Lab, was very moved, and he said to me, I want to help Kim, what can I do? Like, I'm happy to offer my tutoring skills for free for anyone who's like started a bakery but maybe never got formal training. And I was like, let's do some skill shares. So we actually got him in to just lead a group of bakers through a particular baking skill, but I forced him to use our wheat. And then each of the bakers would tack on something that they wanted to share and demonstrate. And those things were really fun and like really like influential. And everybody went away feeling really inspired by the other people that they'd sort of worked with on that day and wanting to replicate things in their bakery. And, yeah, that was a nice thing to do.
Two questions, if that's all right. The first is on the process of mainstreaming models like the Small Food Bakery, and kind of what needs to change either in policy or kind of tackling some of the big lobbying interests to mean that that sort of model is the norm, and you don't get preferential treatment or subsidy policy for the more kind of commercial industrial supply chains.
Yeah, I guess. Do you want to do this other question as well?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
The other one's more about the baking side. You mentioned how you had to change some of your baking practices depending on the changing of flours that you used. I wonder if you could just talk in practical terms about, is it about changing hydration or brewing times, or what are those changes?
I'll start with that question. So the question was, what did I have to change in baking practice to try to work with these non-distinct, uniform and stable wheats? And actually, the very first Grain Lab, I demonstrated the making of my YQ bread, the one that Martin had danced around the kitchen with, to a group of very experienced bakers. I was very nervous because I wasn't a very experienced baker at the time. But they were quite shocked at the things that I had to change. And the kind of, I'll try to sort of reel off the key points. But the first one was, it's a sourdough fermentation of whole grain YQ, but the final dough temperature at the time was 20 degrees. A normal like sourdough practice might involve keeping your doughs between, say, 25 and 27 degrees. So for a lot of bakers, that was like, what? How does it even grow in those temperatures? But it was so alive and volatile that if I had it at a higher temperature, the very fragile network of gluten that was created in this dough would break apart. So that was one thing, as temperature. The mixing was kind of an interesting thing that I had to just play around with. I'm not sure that I've got like a one line of logic, only that you really have to play around with it. And it's like a lot of people say with heritage wheats, don't mix them too long. And I was mixing the YQ for ages. It's not a heritage wheat, but that was interesting, some of the bakers. And then I had, at the time, very different shaping techniques. But we take these doughs to a little kind of full development in the first part of the mixing, and then we allow them to prove relatively undisturbed and cold, not fridge cold, but like at 20 degrees. And that was quite different, I think. And then I always refer to them when I'm teaching people in the bakery as fragile doughs, or they're fragile wheats. So at that point you have to change your whole body and the way that you kind of like interact with the dough. So for those of you not bakers, like if you go into normal artisan bakery working with high protein flour that meets the spec, you'll see people really slapping stuff around and doing lots of folding and rolling and tightening. With these doughs, it's much more like, I don't pre-shape. With the tin loaves, I don't even final shape. I literally just cut the dough and put it really gently. It's like this kind of tiny baby kitten. in order to achieve the maximum, gassing and kind of softness and effect. And so it's things like that, I guess. And then there was like tricks on marketing and stuff, like I put a butterfly on my wholemeal tin loaves to make them look more special. And yeah, just other things like that help me sell them. But the other question was about what needs to change in policy to try to, fix, I guess, or bring about a transformation in the food system. The first thing I'd say is that what we need to do is always to keep asking ourselves at every decision-making junction, we need to keep ourselves in check and make sure we are not recreating the old system with new players. So it's very easy to watch businesses kind of pop up that seem to be offering solutions, and I have a very strict filter in my mind of like, is this business just recreating the old system in their own interest, using some of the ideas that we've discussed today as marketing tools? So we have to be super cautious of that. And what we're looking for really is a lateral expansion rather than a vertical expansion. So it's also really important that we don't create, business cultures that vertically integrate all of the infrastructure. So from just taking an example of a bakery, it would be quite obvious maybe for me to be like, right, I've got my farm and maybe I'm like so interested in seed and grain now with my own population, and maybe I'll get a bit of land and I'll just like contract a farmer to grow my own wheat for small food bakery. We could have small food population. And then I'll be like, right, I could just buy a mill and mill it myself. That's not what we need here. What we need is like devolution of power in the food system so that we've constantly got many hands involved in the production. That's how we create dynamism. Because what we actually need to do is not create a system that stands still. I think we need to be dynamic and keep things moving. Ideas need to be fluid and we need to keep changing. And I think when you vertically integrate businesses like that, they become very tied to financial agreements and they become very rigid, and then that's when things start to become more uniform and more simplified. You need to keep pushing for diversity and complexity and equity amongst as many people as we can possibly involve. How that fits into policy is probably really complicated, and I've put forward many crazy policy ideas to people who might listen in the past. Beginning with, can we have a tax break for vegetable growers to sell homegrown or allotment grown vegetables into local food businesses up to say £4,000 without declaring them on the tax return? That people do that. There's this kind of rent a room scheme that you can rent a room in your house to a lodger without declaring it on your tax, and that's quite motivating way of maybe making a bit of cash. So there are amazing growers and skilled people, even though we've lost our horticulture, market garden, culture, but maybe we could rely on all these organic gardening clubs and things to just start getting food in. So there are tiny policies like that, and again it's about many people being able to put things forward, and how do we just dynamically quickly get those into place rather than having a blanket across the whole country. I'd be very happy to see that happen in Nottingham, for example. And then really huge bits of policy that need changing in order to enable the filtering down of many more people, to work with population wheats, for example. We have to make them legal. So some of you may realise already, but I'll just explain. When we were part of the European Union, Martin and colleagues all over Europe were part of something called a temporary experiment where they were putting together a case for population wheats to be included on national lists and therefore make them legal to trade. And the knock-on effects of that would obviously be that then plant breeders could get funding to develop more populations. People could develop citywide populations through collectives of micro growers and then be able to trade them with farms and kind of explore different ways of bringing those into the food system. At the moment, the law, or back then the law was basically if it's not on the national list, if it doesn't meet distinct, uniform and stable, it's illegal to trade. Doesn't mean it's illegal to eat or for us to bake with, but it means that the farmers can't get the seed in the first place. That's the problem. We have some of the most...
Very small amount.
Yeah, unless it's under 2 kilos or something like that. So that's why the microgrower thing in the Sheffield wheat experiment really caught my attention, because I was like, yes, that's how we get around this. We just have loads of growers. But yeah, so what you guys are doing is amazing. But to get this up to scale, as you asked, the first thing is we need access to seed, and we need plant breeders to be in our community. So I'd like to see, at gatherings like this or in communities surrounding bakeries, plant breeders need to be in that conversation because they're so detached. They're never being asked to breed for flavour. They're never being asked to breed for nutrition. But what else would we like them to breed for? Because there's this whole rainbow out there of things that we're not getting access to, and I've seen some of them in gene banks, and they're beautiful and interesting, and there's blue wheat and purple wheat and black wheat and things that you can't possibly imagine. And as a baker, I'd love to work with all of these things, but we need that plant breeder embedded in our community. So the first thing we have to do is get this huge piece of seed marketing legislation changed. It got changed because of the experiment that Martin was doing with his colleagues across Europe. And in Europe, it is now legal to trade within the organic seed system, to trade populations. And we left the EU 2 months before that piece of law came into effect. So in the UK, it is still currently very difficult to trade these things. So that's something that needs to change. And there's a group of people in the Grain Lab network lobbying DEFRA right now for those changes. So you may start to see more public sort of stories about that. We're hoping to make a film and kind of get more public support for that work. But there's millions of policy changes that need to happen in between, tax breaks for gardeners and, through to massive challenges to the powers that hold all of our seed. And I think, I guess the biggest thing needs to change is that more people need to get involved in making those changes.
From a consumer level, obviously all of us here love this kind of thing. We love bakeries, we love sourdough, all these natural things. But how do you try and reach the people that do just buy normal sandwich bread and don't see it as a thing that they can be bothered? How do you try and get through to the people?
That's such an important question, and I think that has formed such a big part of the discussion in terms of our movement. And my response might be a bit disappointing, which is that I don't worry about it. And I've decided that for me personally, what I need to do is to try to bring about confidence and agency and a sense of change within the food producers. Because going back to something Ruth said earlier, bakers and food producers and people who work in service and hospitality often don't see themselves as particularly important people, but that's crazy because we're feeding people. We're literally on the front line feeding people, and I guess, and we have a huge responsibility. And I think you wouldn't go to a doctor and be that, or you might if you're really switched on, but generally you go to the doctor because they're the expert and you just want them to care for you. And I think we've got to start thinking about that as being our role too, is the customers should be able to come to us and just trust that what they buy is going to be good. And that's what they do at the moment. They go to the supermarket because they trust the supermarket, they trust the brands and they trust the stories and they trust the big systemness of it that is supported by policy. So why would they ever question it? And they probably don't have time, if they're a nurse working shifts, why should they have to engage with what we're talking about today? So I take that responsibility on, and I think what we need to do to have the greatest effect quickly is to actually advocate within the food production and hospitality networks and to give the people who work within it the kind of knowledge and passion and pride and opportunities to really engage and let their voices be heard, and then they in turn can provide the right kind of food. And for most people out there, they just simply don't have access to good bread, and that's not going to change unless we all kind of change it, the people who are passionate and interested and able to make the stuff. It's like when I started the bakery, there were no bakeries in Nottingham. So if I wanted a nice loaf of bread, I'd drive to London and fill my boot, and I got a chest freezer, and I would just go 4 times a year and buy nice bread and then bring it back and put it in my freezer. And so, but I was really obsessed and dedicated, and obviously most people aren't going to do that. But yeah, there just isn't.
That sounds so exciting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there any other?
Sure.
Oh, hang on, I've got one there and one there.
Yeah, I wanted to come to the defence of crisps.
I love crisps.
the title of the talk was like an anarchist approach to baking, which I thought was interesting, but the word hasn't been mentioned.
That's true.
And I sort of extrapolated from a lot of what you've said. You can sort of figure out a few anarchist principles in there, but I wonder, you've got you've got bills to pay, you've got a business to run. I wonder what sort of challenges you face holding those values while at the same time having to operate within, a capitalist system.
Yeah, it's one of the most sort of traumatising, I suppose, elements of running the project or the business. The first thing was I'm very privileged to be in the space that I'm in, which is very, very low rent. We only contribute a rent that covers the running costs of the building for the charity that runs it, and that's quite important. I should probably state that I'm not involved in any kind of organised political movements around anarchy, and we wanted to use that in the title really just to grab people's attention. And for me it was pertinent because I'm constantly being asked to speak to policymakers. And I find it hilarious that I'm just this tiny little bakery in Nottingham that's just been really, literally I've not done as I've been told at any stage of the game. And some of the kind of rebellion element is actually rebelling against my own artisan bakery kind of industry and the dogmas that come from that. But I guess it takes an attitude of anarchy to really change anything, and there's a lot of apathy. If you want to take that as a kind of opposite, there's a lot of people who are just really happy to accept the status quo. But when you start to talk to them and dig a little bit deeper, you realise they do hold very, very different values to the ones they're living every day. So maybe it does take a few kind of more activist type characters to get the ball rolling. I don't know if that really answers your question, but
I sort of see you as an activist.
it does, yeah. It does take up. It takes up a lot of time. That element of it. It's funny. I was talking to someone earlier who was saying kind of accidentally became a spokesperson for this because I loved the YQ wheat so much, and when I first started baking I couldn't even sell things over the counter and have any confidence, and I used to get my partner to do all the trading at markets and things, and then because Martin asked me to speak at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference, I had to get some coaching and speaking in front of an audience because I just couldn't do it. And so it's funny how it was this kind of, oh God, I have to do this. But yeah, I guess we do need many more voices, and we do need sort of many more people just challenging what's normal and why does it exist. But
It's a questioning.
yeah.
Did you? Is there any more? Okay, last
Good.
chance. Okay, I'd really like you to join me in thanking Kim.
Thanks for listening.